zoned. And basically the West End, which was developed organically through the market, was stopped. And when you go to the West End now, you will see it's like somebody came in 1973 and sprinkled frozen powder, and everything is now exactly as it was. And we have seen big price increases, and I do believe that certainly Edward Glaser would say that by allowing height, you will get extra supply that does bring down prices. One of the things that I've been interested in was this idea from our surveys of people who move to the suburbs. What do they want? And quite often they'll say they want a house with a big yard, and they want a fence that does not go against another house. They want a fence that goes against a yard. And what they would prefer is a fence that goes against nothing, you know. So what you get when you get into a high-rise is you get a fence, you get a yard, it's called a balcony, and you get a fence that goes against nothing. Well, that's what people want, you know, and they actually, in the high-rise, you get people moving to downtown because they want anonymity. Like we as social engineers want to program that they're going to meet each other and they're going to interact and whatever. And what people who move into the high-density areas want is they want to be alone. They want anonymity. They actually desire and prefer that they can sort of wander through their life and not be, not have neighbors that are looking down and seeing everything they do and keeping track of them. So anyways, I know you can get density in lower form, but why? Like, is there a really good reason? I think, you know, there is this, it's almost to me religion, that the shorter the better. And when I went to Europe, it was with the Olympics for the Torino event, I went around and I talked to different mayors, and they said, well, we don't have tall buildings here, mainly because if you want to build a tall building, you have to dig a parking lot. And if you dig a hole, you find a ruin. And if you find a ruin, then the fences go around and the white tape and the people with the suits come in with their glasses. But there also is there's this thing that when I try to find out what is behind the anti-height sentiment, there's sometimes you will say that you cannot build higher than the church steeple, or you can't build higher than the Duke's home, you know. And there's something about being uppity. When you get too high, you know, there's jealousy that fits in. So there's a class element to do it.
So I want to, the first of Jeff's points strikes me as ignoring the law of supply and demand, that we see filtering. Just make a quick finish, which is that that if you build luxury high rises, then you could then people don't move into who would pay a lot, don't move into the less luxury housing. And so where we don't see building, we see the conversion of traditionally available housing into luxury housing. And so that one doesn't do very much for me. The second question, it strikes me as a much more interesting one. And so Paris, famously a very low-rise city, is 6 times as dense as Washington, D.C. It's a very, very dense place. It's still very expensive, but it's very dense. And that's not counting La Defense. What strikes me about the difference between these, so I think you can get density, whether you'd want it, but you can get low-rise, not mid-rise density. I think you cannot get it in the United States. And we've never seen an American city develop mid-rise density of that sort in the post-zoning era. So Brooklyn would be the one example we have, and Brooklyn was developed, what you think of as Brooklyn was developed either outside of zoning or with a very weak zoning regime following the first Zoning Act in Brooklyn. And the story is we give local governments a lot of power to regulate form, and we give neighborhoods a lot of power to regulate form. When Sam noted a lot, a little, or a little, a lot.
Taxi.
Okay, well, goodbye. Thank you so much.
Sorry, my taxi's
here.
Thank you.
I think that while there's that it's not theoretically impossible, I wonder about Sam's point whether it's actually attractive or not, whether we should cease, whether we should give ducal forms or the church the honor it gets in other places. So I think that's an interesting question, but also it's not politically practicable in the American legal context.
Before Sam exits the room, I should say I concede the supply and demand discussion because God knows I argue the other side of that so many times. I think probably that what I've witnessed in my career looking at these things is that where it's happened in such a small amount that it hasn't had a market impact on the market.
Yeah.
Sorry, do you want?
No, it's good. Yeah,
I have one other thing if you want more. The other, as I think about it, the other angle I would take on this is I think in a city that's pretty much built up, where the blocks are full, where it's lively and active and people need space, there's probably no downside to just allowing people to go even higher. My principal compulsion against no height limit is what you see for areas like Baton Rouge and Houston and downtowns which were not doing well, and where there was either a fair amount of empty space or a bunch of decrepit buildings, in which case the removal of height limits caused whoever got the investor first would develop a single lot to tremendous height, absorb 5 years of demand, put all the other buildings out of business, cause old buildings to be torn down to provide parking for the new skyscraper, and cause all surrounding landowners to speculate and not develop their property because they're waiting for the next big skyscraper developer. So that's a practical issue in cities that are not lively, not full, and probably has given me a knee-jerk allergy to eliminating height limits. But I think in the condition of a place like a Washington that is full and healthy, but we'd have to be very careful because there are parts of Washington that aren't full and healthy. It might be appropriate.
So do we have another question?
Yeah, this is great, and you guys can keep the crosstalk up as we go. I actually also want to see if we got any tweets in, because I want to make sure that our audience that's out there listening
Hey, Twitter.
has the ability to tweet in, right? But I I want to reset a little bit so we're clear on facility management, right? So it's a multidisciplinary profession. It's the International Facility Management Association. It's a multidisciplinary profession, right, focused on the built environment to integrate people, place, process, and technology. So when we think about the people in whatever environment to support productive work. So it doesn't matter whether it's a 10,000 square foot space in a 10-story high-rise or a smart building or a smart city anywhere in the world. And so we start from, and I'm going to make some comments and I'm going to ask a question, right? So, because I also want to know, at some point, I want to talk about our core competencies and talk about competencies and get your feedback on that also. And actually, anyone else in the room as well as any of our people tweeting. So when we look at our people that we're building all this stuff for productive work, right? We say, okay, well, how do we engage their productivity and wellness, right? So they're 24/7 wired, 24/7 wired. They're on all the time. Our people are in survival mode, right? Moms and dads both working, running hard every day. You know, the boomers, we're hanging on, right? We're not leaving. We're hanging in here. The millennials, they're going to be 45% of the workforce by 2020. And then the iGen, so the next generation hasn't been formally named unless you guys have a name for that next generation, but I'm calling it the iGen, and that's what I've heard, so I'm repeating.
It's good.
It's good, yeah, use it. We don't know what the heck they want with respect to work or the work environment. What I will tell you is that there's a need for a social experience in a network of spaces where bricks and mortar place is being minimized. And so when we look at place, so people, place, process, and technology, that's the way we think. Integration of that, maximizing and leveraging that. So what's the role of place? If people are in a legacy workplace, are in their assigned space less than 40% of the time, why are we driving them to places that they're not really using? And how do we leverage all those places, including cities, as some nexus, some energy, that now are becoming collaborative cities, right? Not just competitive cities, to leverage this global network of places. So as a big employer, we're looking around the world and saying, and Jeff, I was the guy who said walkable is not in my site selection criteria today, it's going to be in the future. And we say, geez, let's lift and shift the labor out of this market and put it into a market where we're going to save $100 million a year. And they love to drive, they don't like to walk. So profits is driving that versus maybe sort of a more holistic people, place, process, really the triple bottom line. So facility, and obviously profits is key. Economic viability around all this is critical, along with the things around energy and optimization and technology and water and all those other things that we think about tactically but also strategically. So, you know, when you think about walking in bikes, so great initiative, the mayor's going to put bike trails in, bikes are coming in, they're not allowed in the buildings. We don't let them in, liability. Garages don't let them in, liability. It's a big problem in cities, right? And so some cities, they got it licked, but others, they don't. There's all kind of issues that we can get into around the next level of taking this to another level through owned and leased properties that we manage or plan. So, and I could talk for probably a lot more detail around that. But so if I just said, and I want to point to those 11 core competencies and say what's missing or what needs to be added. I'm not there yet, but I'd love to hear some kind of comment on that. So one question for you guys would be is, how do you believe human interaction will be materially impacted by the future of cities?
So, I mean, I think that was
And you can
fantastic.
react to any of what I just said.
It was really, really rich. And as Sam said earlier, the number of questions that this high-level theorizing leaves out is are really enormous and should inform the high-level theorizing. So if the bikes can't get into the buildings, then the bike lanes are a real problem, right? And so that's a really big problem. The first thing I'd say, I mean, kind of in response to your question, how is the kind of broad thing is, how is place changing versus, you say, holistic versus profits? So as an economist, I would never say anything other than profits are where it's at, right? It's the things that's driving this, though, that place is becoming more and more economically valuable to people. So being in a world where we have a more idea-driven economy than we do kind of a brawn-driven economy. The conversations people have and the technology, you've got the guy talking to the venture capitalist, talking to the product designer, that these things make available are valuable both to the labor force that you're trying to get draw and to the companies. The companies want, if you're a venture capital fund, you want to be where the action is, right? And so sure you could save in rent, but it's not going to be worth it to you. And so I don't think any of this is super valuable unless it's affecting people's actual decisions. It's a empirical assumption, and I think one with a great deal of evidence, if you look at, say, the evidence of how China is developing, how urbanization is growing, that this is an increasing force. But if we're wrong, that it's economically valuable, then this is window dressing. But we're not wrong. At least I'm not. So Jeff might be, we'll see.
I'm going to be wrong. Well, you said a couple of things. I don't think I can answer your question directly, but you said a couple of things that piqued ideas that I'd like to share. The first I thought was very interesting and eye-opening for you to ask the question, how will human interaction be impacted by the future of cities? Because it's our job, at least my job, to ask that question in reverse, which is how will cities be impacted by the future of human interaction? And for years and years, we've all been talking about, and you mentioned this, David, in your remarks, we've all been talking about how every time there's been a new technology, there's been this supposition that we're not going to need our old cities, that somehow our old cities won't serve us as well, or we won't care to use what they're offering, because technology frees us from the need for this face-to-face, nose-to-nose contact. And you talked about Toffler. My experience of Toffler and what little I've read of him was actually high-tech, high-touch. One of the things he said as a futurist was, the more we spend our days, crunching data on computers, the more we need to have physical contact with each other to make up for that, and to have that human element in our lives. So I think, to answer your question, how will human interaction be impacted by the future of cities? Well, I think that question presumes that we have more control than we do. And in fact, the future of cities is an outcome through various political forces and social forces. The future of cities is an outcome of human interaction, and hopefully we'll serve it well. But I think what we've learned from generation after generation of evolution is that the traditional city serves us better than anything we've been able to invent since then. And that makes me curious about Mostar. But I think Mostar, to Sir Foster's credit, has many aspects of it that are a return to traditional networked building patterns, as opposed to this what's called dendritic the branching systems or hub and spoke systems that were the basis for sprawl. And one thing we started to talk about before lunch was how interesting it is that, as you learn more about communication and artificial intelligence and the evolution of technology, is that the more systems are networked versus hubbed, the more effective they are, the smarter they are, the better they can evolve. That's if you want a real artificial intelligence, like you put together, like SETI, right? You put together lots of little computers in the biggest and most robust network that you can, as opposed to having a hub and spoke system. And for me as a planner, trying to recover from 5 decades of hub and spoke planning as a way to organize cities, this is a real comfort to learn that there's an analogous error in the making of things.
And I mean, one thing that kind of coming back to the competencies that you asked is that it strikes me that almost all of the things that you're talking about happening inside buildings are exactly what we're talking about happening between buildings. So how do you get people to interact with one another? What's the methods that you do to get people in offices to work together? Well, it's roughly the same problem that you're talking about getting people across cities. And so the example of Facebook, right? So Facebook develops a built space to approximate the life of a city, except with the crucial part of that they can't talk to anyone who doesn't work at Facebook. And so that's a method where they're taking a traditional building form, the university campus, and fitting it to the corporate needs of Facebook. And so if you look through all of these things, it strikes me that it is, that across each one of them, you could make a kind of analogy and have an analogical relationship to a lot of the things that we've been talking about with respect to in-between cities. And so, I mean, it's the things that I find most interesting about what you said, and I thought this was really neat, was that there may be conflicts, right? So you may have situations where best practices in one area are running into best practices in another area. So people get super excited about bike lanes, and bike lanes are really cool, and I like the bike lanes even though I don't bike. But if it turns out that it's really difficult for buildings to have parking, I mean, I think that you can probably do it, and there are all sorts of things. Maybe we need to think of kind of mid-level strategies, public parking for or paid parking, or shoop parking for bicycles. What? Boo. So I mean, I think that these things kind of are interesting, and again, we can only begin a process right now, but I think it's a really interesting set of problems.
Is there anyone else in the audience that wants to comment on sort of the facility perspective vis-a-vis the IFMA link, so we can get a jump start?
Something sort of related. Based on some of my experiences as a workplace consultant, anecdotally, I've worked with a lot of organizations that are thinking they need to go back to the city. They moved away a long time ago to a corporate campus somewhere in the suburbs, and they're thinking to attract millennials in particular, that they need a presence in the city if they want to be competitive. But they have this challenge that they have a lot of boomers and maybe Gen Xers who have families and who have moved to the suburbs who can't realistically move to the cities. So I guess, interestingly, they've come up with different schemes where they move to the city and they let the boomers and Gen Xers telecommute, add that to their capabilities, or they do the opposite. They try to hire millennials and maybe create a satellite city in the office, or let them telecommute as a way to attract that talent in. But I guess the bigger question is there a generational effect on transition or transformations that we're seeing in cities? And are you anticipating one as millennials, who seem to be driving some of the enthusiasm now, start having families?
Yeah, I think I have a bunch of stories for you, and I'll be very quick. But I think just thinking logically about what you were saying, I gave a talk, well, it happened to be for Midtown Progress, which is Midtown Atlanta, just 2 days ago, and it was at the headquarters of PricewaterhouseCoopers, and the Mr. Price, believe it or not, I guess a second or third generation, said to me, guess what our average workforce median age is? It's 27. So if you think about the pyramid of ages of who's in your workforce and their related incomes and their each one's wants and needs, I think you'd find that by locating facilities downtown, you're serving a greater proportion of the workforce, giving a greater proportion of the workforce a shorter commute, but also you're asking the longer commute of the people who have the greater resources and the capacity to drive in and out and do all the things that the lesser paid younger people can't do. So it seems to make more sense from that perspective. But then the other thing you were talking about, a hub or breaking off a piece of the company is something we're seeing more and more. And I tell the story right at the beginning of my book of Wolverine Worldwide, where I talked to the CEO, Blake Kruger, and he said, you know, we were having a real problem. They make Patagonia footwear and a bunch of other stuff. A lot of brands you know are made by Wolverine. They said we were having trouble retaining creative talent because the spouse's perception was they couldn't break into the social scene. And we learned that the reason they felt that way is that all the, they were in suburban West Michigan, all of the social events were reached by automobile and thus by invitation. And there was no chance for these chance encounters on the street that lead to friendships that you find in more urban places. And they decided to found their next design division in Portland. Said, this isn't right. So they created a urban innovation hub in downtown Grand Rapids with 3 other companies and 12 different product lines total, where they put their young creative staff and they can all bounce ideas off each other. Lots of them live downtown, they play downtown, and they found that creating a sub-facility like that can be very, can be game-changing.
So I think there's 2 things, and one is I think that's a great example of how these type of stories should inform urban planning. So one problem we see is that if you need to house in one location a variety of people with different life needs and goals, one potential solution is that you're going to put the employer in the catch-22. The other story we could ask is what could we do in our cities to make them more available such that there were places or either our cities more livable for families and or make our suburbs more livable for millennials. And so a lot of what people are talking about is, you know, when you talk about kind of TOD or transit-oriented development, it's about making, it's sometimes about making the suburbs easier to get into the city. It's also sometimes about making reverse commutes easier. And so both things are going on. The second thing is that I actually think there's something going on that kind of is contradictory to what you're saying. So one of the biggest workplace stories or kind of world of work stories that you've in the last, say, 6 months was Yahoo's decision to ban working from home or telecommuting. Yeah. And this was critiqued along a number of ways which I think were perfectly fair about how difficult it is for family life, but it also struck me as a kind of powerful urban story, right? So what they're saying is very much, we need in-person contact inside our offices. Our workers are less productive when they work from home, not only because they slack off, because there's actually not a lot of evidence of slacking off outside of the office, but rather because there's something about bouncing ideas off. And so we have this weird contrast, which is between, to make people's lives easier, we may be removing from them the things that make them productive, and by making them more productive, we may be making their lives hard. And so we're constantly dealing with these type of issues, and it causes really big conflict. So think about what happened with Marissa Mayer after she made that announcement. She was demonized on the cover of the New York Times, and I don't want to just everywhere, really. And maybe she should have been. I don't know. I don't have a kind of global belief on what Yahoo's work-from-home strategy should be. But it's exactly the dynamic we're talking about here and the dynamic you're talking about, which is there's this real kind of pressing conflict between some of these information spillover stories and the need to accommodate different lifestyles.
It's amazing. I mean, that's a company that's dedicated towards kind of virtual reality, refocusing on the real reality. If I could just very briefly, because you asked, turn to the core competencies. and something else that, sir, you mentioned, which was that that people are spending less than 40% of their time at the workplace, and that somehow, well, you weren't suggesting that it somehow lessens the importance of the decisions we make, but I think that how do I want to put this? Yes, they're spending 40% of their time in their workplace buildings, and that makes those buildings inherently inefficient, and that's probably something that we can't change. But to make the buildings and all the infrastructure and all the plumbing and all the electricity and all the roads and transit, whatever it may be, that surrounds these buildings also only used 40% of the time is a tremendous inefficiency that you're paying for one way or another, if not through your own facilities costs, then through taxation, and someone has to pay the bill eventually. So I think that's a very powerful argument for consolidating within the same neighborhood, workplace, and living and shopping and everything else.
And we see it in public buildings too, right? So like making schools multi-use and multi-thing is the exact
community
same
centers.
principle.
But then in terms of your competencies, I don't think you're missing any. I think that I would put a finer point on some of them and maybe what some of them mean. So when you describe your desire for a more healthful and safe environment, then that points to all of the imperatives that I discussed in my first talk about freeing people from the burden of driving all day. And when you talk about environmental stewardship and sustainability, again, it's not thinking about what the carbon footprint, this is the same discussion I have with the Department of Homeland Security. Don't think about what the carbon footprint of your buildings are. Think about what the carbon footprint of the lives of the people who are using your buildings are. If you truly care, it shouldn't be just what you have to pick up the tab for, or it shouldn't be what, you might, in the final calculation, be going up or down for. It's the quality of lives that you are allowing or causing your ultimate clients, the workers, to have. And I would argue that everything on that list makes a lot of sense, but I would reframe it in a more holistic, global way, and not just thinking about the buildings themselves.
So I actually think that's really neat. It's like that's like the debate about LEED ND versus traditional LEED. Should you have a neighborhood LEED standard versus having a building-centric one, which is a conflict that's going on at the moment. So
let's not get into LEED ND.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
If I can comment shortly on what you're saying, I think that was a thing I noticed within the facility management arena, and what you've been talking about is density. And what I see now in workplace innovation, we are creating a higher density workplace as well. So basically that's the same kind of play that we're playing. We do it inside the building. So I see a tremendous same type of thinking within facility management on this subject as well.
Yeah, so one really powerful example of that I thought of while we were talking here is so I've done a bunch of New York examples. It's a life problem, but Bloomberg's decision to turn the city hall into a bullpen system rather than a system of offices. So one way that's roughly the same move as saying we need to have lots and lots of small mixed use things, except internal to a building rather than external to a building. That were to have, and so it strikes me that you're exactly right that it's exactly the same type of issues. And that's not just, it shouldn't be said that more density is always better at the workplace or in the city. There may be sweet spots, the market will drive certain things, there are things like that, but it does strike me that the problems are really, really similar. Other questions? Well, thank you all so much. What? Yeah. Thank you all so much. This was really terrific. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to come talk here, and I really have learned a lot, and it's really been wonderful.
I would add that, in months after months in which I've been essentially pushing the same arguments in place after place, and thinking perhaps less and less, I've done more deep thinking this afternoon than I have in a long time, so thank you for making me do that.
We're going to now turn it over to Mark for some final statements.
Good. Well, first of all, I do want to thank, gentlemen, you, Eric, and Sam, who's not here, for really an enriching, my mind is spinning. That's all we had. I think we had 20 people taking the notes, and you guys were just killing us with all that great information. So thank you so much for being a part of this landmark event, and let's just give them a hand first of all. We do that.
Thank you.
I really want to recognize Eric for all of his efforts. He's been working on this since what? Last July or August. And for IFMA in supporting this, because it really is a stretch. I mean, the purpose of this particular event was to be a stretch. And facility management professionals, we're good at stretching. We're resilient, we're tough. We don't know we've gone far enough until we've gone too far, right? And then we step back. But we do it in a way where we lead the conversation because why? Because the planners turn over the built environment to us. We hold it for several hundred years. We look at it from a life cycle total cost of ownership standpoint at the people, and we try to drive value with our partners in all the functional areas, whether it's HR, IT, risk management, urban planners. We don't talk to them too much, and that's why this is so material, because we want to try and have influence and be influenced through this conversation, which I think was a great start to this conversation, and hopefully we'll follow up at our workplace. So when I was sort of writing my thoughts about what I would say at the end here, it made me go back to the beginning of IFMA. So the International Facility Management Association, something happened in 1978 when Herman Miller held a conference called, I know you all remember this, it's right off the top of your head, Facility Influence on Productivity. And at that conference, the primary question was, how should an office environment be created, operated, and maintained to enable optimum employee productivity? And I think we're still talking about people and optimum productivity in a holistic, social, wellness, sustainable manner. I think we're still focused on that question, but in a much bigger way. So the question was created as a reaction to changing conditions at that time. And speaking to one of our founders, George Graves, he said, Mark, they're throwing these electrified typewriters and machines on these old 30 by 60 metal desks, and we're all trying to figure out how to make this environment work better, so we got together and talked about it. And that's obviously what we do in our organization now of 23,000. But it was a reaction to the changing conditions at that time. The answer continues to evolve today as the office environment is now anywhere, right? We talked about that today. And optimum productivity is not considered, but what's expected always. And I talked about 24/7. So as we remember that day in '78 when IFMA was born by a small group of thought leaders reacting to changing environmental conditions, this conference and symposium in 2013 will be remembered in the future as the day IFMA began to influence and create and be influenced a new perception of FM and the future of place on a global scale. So again, I want to thank our guest speakers. I want to thank Eric. Thank you for being a part of this initial event, and let's have a great conference. Take care.